So, a few years ago, I think this will work. So a few years ago, I was speaking at a camp called Quasin. This is up in the Muskokas. This is a picture of their outdoor chapel. I can't remember when exactly this happened. I think my kids were still campers at that time. And I was doing chapel, and one of the things I said was this. I said that as a parent, my goal for my kids is not to make them happy. And I remember all these kids were looking at me like, what are you talking about? Right? It was such a foreign concept. They were thinking, what do you mean? Your goal isn't to make your kids happy. And I remember I said then, my goal is to help them discover God's purpose for them. Now, they might be happy with that, but there are times where they're going to struggle with that. There are going to be times when they're not going to know what that means. There are going to be times when it's just something that they are trying to work through. And while happiness is something that we like to feel, my purpose when I'm working with my kids is not to make them happy. That's not what I'm trying to do. So they got me thinking, what is God's purpose for his children? Because I think a lot of times we have this idea that somehow God is going to somehow make our life good. And there's a difference between good and happy. Because if you look through sometimes, we come across passages like this. This is from Genesis chapter 12, verse 3. I'm going to ask all of us to read together. Whether you want to read in Mandarin or English, your choice. But we're going to read this together at a count of 3. Ready? 1, 2, 3. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who will treat you with contempt. All the families of earth will be blessed because of you. And so if you're not familiar with this passage, this comes from in Genesis when God is talking to Abraham. Abraham at that point in time was someone who had a lot of wealth, but he was originally situated in one place, and then God basically said, no, I want you to leave this place and go somewhere, but didn't actually tell him where he was going exactly at first. But he just said go, because through this action, I'm going to bless you. But notice the last part of that verse, right? I'm going to bless you so that you can be a blessing to the nations. Because this idea of blessing isn't just for Abram. It was meant for him to extend it to others around him. And so with that, that's one of the things, as we start delving into this, what does it actually mean to be a child of God then? What does it actually mean to be someone who follows Jesus? What does it actually mean to be a Christian? Because if you go around asking people, what does it actually mean? Define a Christian. You'll hear these different things, right? Some of it's good, some of it's not so good, right? Sometimes you'll hear people who say something like, sometimes, Christians seem to be helpful. Maybe they seem to be kind. In some cases, people might say they seem to be passive-aggressive, and sometimes they seem to be, they seem to be hypocritical, right? Well, there's all these different things words that people use to define what a Christian is. But what exactly is Jesus defining it as? And so this morning we're going to go through a couple of passages that maybe are more commonly used, or at least have been talked about regularly. Here's one of them. This is from Matthew chapter 16, verses 24 and 25. So again, you might be familiar with this. I'm going to ask you again to read it all together on the count of 3, whichever language. Ready? 1, 2, 3. And so it's interesting, right? Because when Jesus says, this is what's going to define you, the definition of your life now, if you choose to follow him, is one that says, I will actually forego my life for the sake of his cause. And what's the sake of his cause? The sake of his cause is actually to help others to discover who he is. And sometimes this means that this idea of denying yourself. Now, sometimes the thing is this. We have this misunderstanding of what denial means. Sometimes we think of this denial of, I can never think of myself. I can never, I have to put everything I want, everything I care about, everything I feel, I have to put it aside no matter what. And sometimes we look at that of God, I will go through, I will just, whatever happens to me, I will not worry about it all. But this idea of denial is actually rooted in this concept of I will somehow not put what I want first. Because even look at this, right? It says that if you try to hang on to your life, you will lose it. Right? The more that you try to struggle and hold on to something, you will lose it. The other day, I had a conversation with someone who's in this relationship, and she seems to be struggling with this idea of how I want this relationship to work. I want it to work. I want it to work. I want it to work. And the problem is that when you keep on trying to strive for that, you'll lose it. Parents, sometimes we do this with our kids. We want them to grow. We want them to grow. And yet, sometimes when we want them to grow, we hold on to them so hard, we lose them. So Jesus is saying, when you hold on to your life so hard, if you want what you want so hard, in the end, it's not going to matter because you're going to lose it. But he says, for my sake, Jesus says, for my sake, you will save it. It's a paradox, right? If I let go of my life for his sake, somehow that will actually save it. So in other words, if I don't try to concern myself about how I'm going to live what I want to live and let go of that to Jesus, somehow he will save my life. In his book, Purpose-Driven Life, this is what Rick Warren says. When you look at the idea of the purpose of a life, this is what he says. It's not about you. The purpose of your life is far greater than your personal fulfillment, your peace of mind, or even your happiness. It's far greater than your family, your career, or even your wildest dreams and ambitions. If you want to know why you were placed on this earth, you must begin with God. You were born by his purpose and for his purpose. See, a lot of times, I know that people will say, if you have a dream, if you have ambition, hold on to it, go for it. If you believe it, it will come true. And I look at them like, I don't know. I mean, how many hockey parents out there are thinking, my kid's going to be the next McDavid? And they spend countless hours going on to tournaments all over the place, hoping that their kid is going to be the one who's going to be making $18 million a year. We all know there's only one Connor McDavid. So if you strive and hold on to what you think you want so hard, Jesus says you will lose it. The life that you think you want, you're going to lose it. Because we miss then why God created us in the first place for. And I think sometimes this quote just kind of hits it home. It's far greater than your own fulfillment. It's far greater than your own happiness. It's far greater than your own peace of mind. There's something about that. If those are the things that sometimes we are striving for, the more that you try to, you will lose it. You will, because it's not rooted in who God is. So then what does that mean? What does that mean for us going forward? Some of you might remember a few weeks ago, we had Reverend Johnny Delisa here. And this is one of his reminders to us during that.
Are we doing what God has called us to do?
我们在这个现在有回应上帝呼召我们该做的吗？
God gave the church 3 very important commandments.
上帝给了教会3个非常重要的命令。
First, we read in Matthew 28:19 and 20.
第一个，我们看到马太福音13章19到20节。
Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Teach these new disciples to obey all the commands I have given you, and be sure of this, I am with you always, even to the end of the age.
所以你们要去，使万民做我的门徒，奉父、子、圣灵的名给他们施洗。Next， 凡我所吩咐你们的，都教训他们遵守，我就常与你们同在，直到世界的末了。
Okay, and then in Matthew 22:37 and 39.
在马太福音22章13到37到39节。
You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself.
耶稣对他说：“你要尽心、尽性、尽意爱主你的神。其次也相仿，就是要爱人如己。”
So we ask ourselves, are we making disciples?
所以让我们来思考：我们有为主赢得使徒吗？
Are we making disciples who are making disciples?
我们有建造使徒，让他们再去建造使徒吗？
Are we growing in our love for God?
我们对主的爱有在增加吗？
Are we disciples making disciples? It's a key question that Johnny challenged us with. Because again, the more that you hold on to your own life, for your own ambitions, for your own happiness, the more that you hold on to that, you will lose it. But his sake is that we who choose to follow him will then choose to help others to follow him. That's what it means to live for his sake, for his cause. His cause is that others will actually choose to embrace the life that God intended originally. So are we actually disciples making disciples? I gotta be honest, there are many times I don't. There are many times I'm so concerned about my own finances, my own bank account, what is happening with me, that I forget we are here to make disciples. We are here to be part of helping others to discover who God is. And now extend that not just to the individual now, but what does it mean for us as a church, as Mimico Baptist Church? There are a couple of verses that we tend to use with this. And this one, I think this is coming up. This is from Acts chapter 2. Now, there's 6 verses here, so here's what I'm going to suggest. I'm going to ask if there are 6 volunteers who want to read 1 verse each. Feel free to read it when it comes up, all right? So there's 6 verses. If you don't want to read it, that's fine. I'll read it for us. But here's the first one, verse 42. Can I have someone read this one, please? A lot of times, this particular passage is used to describe the early church. And so a lot of times people, when they talk about this idea of we need to be like the Acts 2 church, this is what they're referring to, right? This idea that people who came together, who shared what they had, whatever it was, with one another and beyond. They have this. They seem to have this immense fellowship with one another. This intense fellowship that somehow grew together. And yet, but the thing is interesting with this is that it says here at the end, right? It says that each day the Lord added to their fellowship those who were being saved. Now, here's the thing, though. This idea of the adding of the fellowship, this wasn't a passive element. This wasn't like a passive occurrence. It wasn't like this group of people who the early church was there and they were huddled together and doing all this stuff, and somehow people, almost like zombies, wandered into this group of people and like, I want this, and they just kind of somehow got absorbed into this group called the early church. They weren't this like insular focused group that somehow other people were not able to be part of it, but rather it was a group of people, and notice that at the beginning of this, right? All the while praising God, enjoying the goodwill of all the people. So somehow they took what they were experiencing and they were actually actively now passing it on. They were actually actively inviting others. They were actively being involved in other people's lives so that they would see what this is, so that those people then said, I want to be a part of this. I mean, how many times on a Sunday morning do we come here, and a lot of times I hear sometimes, I wish there were more people here, and yet what do we do about that? What do we do about that? People are not just going to walk in here aimlessly. Now, sometimes it happens. Don't get me wrong. There are sometimes when God moves in a person's life and they just happen to walk in, which is great. But that's not how it works. It works when we actually want to invite others in to be part of this fellowship. That's how we start drawing people in. That's what it means. Earlier we read this, Hebrews chapter 10. These two verses, I'm going to ask us to read this together on the count of three, in whatever language. Ready? 1, 2, 3. I don't know how many times I've heard people use this passage saying that, yes, we need to meet regularly. I get that. I agree with that. But we miss the purpose of why we are supposed to meet together in the first place. We are not meeting together for the sake of ourselves. We are not meeting together just so that we feel better. We are meeting together for this purpose, so that we motivate one another to acts of love and good works. And not just for ourselves, but for the people who don't know Jesus. For people right now who are sitting in their living room, or maybe they're in bed right now, and they don't experience, because how many of them are trying to hold on to their life so much that they're going to lose it? Dietrich Bonhoeffer says this: the church is the church only when it exists for others, not dominating, but helping and serving. It must tell men and people of every calling what it means to live for Christ, to exist for others. Mimico Baptist Church, I think sometimes we've forgotten this. Yes, I know some of you individually, you go and you extend the love of Christ to others, which is good. I think sometimes we've missed this as a church. I think sometimes we get so focused on what we need to do as a church, we forget we exist for others. A couple of weeks ago, actually a little while ago, this guy named Reverend Tim Tang, who used to be the English pastor at East Toronto Chinese Community Church, Chinese Baptist Church, was also the director of the Tyndale Intercultural Ministry Center. Passed away a couple of years ago. I remember he described the church like this. He said the church is kind of like a wave. It goes out and it goes in. It reaches out into the communities around it, and then there are times when it comes back in to gather together so that it can go back out again and then come back together. This idea that it goes out so that it brings other things back in. It goes out, and this rhythm of, yes, there are times when we gather, like a Sunday morning like this, when we gather together, this is the part where we come in, which is good. But I think sometimes we forget about the going out part as a church. We put so much energy into our coming in together that we don't have the same amount of energy going out. We don't actually spend the same kind of resources, the same kind of time, the same kind of focus, because we forget sometimes. We get so insulated with what we need to do as a group together. How do we actually have this time together that we forget about the going out? A little while ago, Pastor Johnny reminded us of these 3 questions in reflection. He said, is there anything we need to stop doing? Is there anything that we need to continue doing? Is there a new thing we need to start doing? Now, here's the thing. If we are serious about trying to figure this out together as a church, these are going to be hard questions for us to go through. Because these questions are going to push and challenge us. There are things that maybe you want to hold on to that we need to let go of. There are things that maybe God is pushing us towards that maybe we're going to feel very uncomfortable trying to do it. Maybe we will feel stretched. Maybe we'll even feel like something that is very uneasy, very unsettling. But maybe that's where we need to go. And so that's one of the things that we need to start looking at with this. You know, going back to Rick Warren, he has this quote from his church, Purpose-Driven Church. He said, in every church, there's a constant tension between the concepts of service and serve us. Through my work with CBOQ, I've seen enough churches where so many times they hire a pastor because you are meant not for service, but to serve us. I gotta admit, sometimes I think we use Pastor Jim that way too. I think there were times when we actually focused on Pastor Jim, not for the works of service, but we wanted him to serve us. And perhaps that's something that we actually need to repent of. A couple of weeks ago, Pastor David challenged us with this.
Have we lost the real urgency or the reason for our mission to the world? To, how do we phrase it, to share Christ with our communities?
Have we? I fear that sometimes we have. I fear that sometimes we get so caught up in what we think we need to somehow build together that we lose sight of what it means to bring Christ to our communities. I know the last couple of months we've been talking about what does it mean for us to move forward. I know I've put out there, here's how I think I could be part of that with you. And I know for some of you, what we've been talking about the last couple of months has been very uncomfortable. It hasn't been easy. I know for some of you, what we've been talking about it seems so foreign. It seems like, what do you mean in terms of what we think we're trying to do, what you're suggesting we do? I know sometimes it's going to be very stretching. This afternoon, we're going to talk a little bit more about what that means, what that looks like. And in a few weeks, we're going to decide, is this the direction we're going to move forward? Here's the thing I'm just going to put on the table right now with that. If we go ahead with this, it will be hard. I'm not going to lie to you. If we are serious about what we think we are going to do moving forward, it will be very uncomfortable because many of you are going to be asked to let go of things that you're holding on to because you believe because it's something that maybe is dear to you, or maybe something that that brings comfort to you, or maybe something that you're thinking, this is the way we've always been, this is what we've always done, and yet maybe God is saying, well, guess what? You're over 100 years old now. Maybe it's time to change something. Maybe it is. So here's my challenge. Are we ready to move forward, even if it makes us uncomfortable? Even if our own personal needs are not met? Even if we must sacrifice what we want so that others may know and love Jesus? And don't answer that right now. This is a question that I hope as you pray through it will actually dig into something into you that maybe you actually have realized you've been holding on to and that we need to let go of. Because I think where God is taking us is not going to look like what this church was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. It will look different. But in that looking different, be prepared that there are going to be some things that you hold on to that are going to be things that we need to let go of. So, Mimico Baptist Church, if this is where we think we're moving forward, are you ready for it? Now, here's the other thing, too. I'm not presuming that what we've been talking about the last 2 months is the direction that we must go no matter what. We're Baptists. We get to talk about this. No one's going to say to you, this is what you have to do. So the Baptist side of us says, you know what, let's talk about it, and like Baptists, we vote on it later. But in that conversation, let's be honest about what this is going to look like. I got to be honest with you. My fear is this. My fear is that we might feel so uncomfortable, we think, I need to go back to what makes me feel safe. I need to go back to what makes me, what I remember as what worked, whatever that meant. My own personal opinion, I think if we go back that way, we now exist for ourselves, not for others. So here's what I'm going to ask us to do. Before we continue on in worship, I'm going to ask you to take a moment. And maybe God doesn't have an exact answer for you right now. Maybe there's something in you that God is saying, actually, I want you to dwell on this question later. Because the fact is that this question is going to take time, and it's going to take patience, but it's going to rattle you. Because perhaps God will reveal something that says, actually, you've been trying to hold on to this, and you need to let it go. In order for us to go forward as a church, we need to let this part go. I'm not saying what it is right now. I'm not going to suggest what it is right now. But that will be part of our discovery in the next several months if we go forward this way. But I want you to be ready for it. I don't want you to presume that this is going to be an easy ride. This will make you uncomfortable. You will actually feel potentially pain in this. Because I wonder if God's going to reveal something in some of us and us as a church that maybe we realize we have been holding on so tight that maybe that's been part of our problem. And to let go may be painful. But for the sake of others, to know and to love Jesus that I believe many of you know and love Jesus as, is it not worth it? So take a moment in silence to sit in this. Sit in this question. And then, Jan, when you're ready, feel free to lead us in a response in worship. But in the silence, just sit in this question.